of life from the front line, if you like, of the Ukrainian war. He's with us in the studio. How are you, Luke?
Ian, I'm very good. Nice to see you.
Why do you... I mean, you've survived quite a lot, really, in your time as a journalist, haven't you? Because people often go, why do you put yourself in those places? I think it was... Nick Robertson was asked this question, you know, why do you stand outside Downing Street when you could just be sitting in a studio? And he said, well, because you can, and it's, you know, that's what journalism is. It's being there, even if it's just standing outside a glossy door. In your case, it's ramped up a little further. The stakes are higher. But it's not an easy job, being a war correspondent.
It's not an easy job, but I do think it's the purest form of journalism, because you're not phoning a press office or trying to reach someone from government. What you have to do every day is, if you're on the front line, you have to go with a car, in a vehicle, to some kind of dangerous places, and you have to talk to people.
Yeah.
So it's sort of reporting at its most elemental. You talk to people, you get their stories, you describe the landscape, you hear the boom of artillery going out and the whistle of Russian missiles coming in, and then you try and give a flavour, a portrait, if you like, of the biggest war in Europe since 1945. It's a huge story. It's not over, and I think we're obliged to cover it.
Are you intrigued by the... I mean, there are other narratives out there about, you know, people talk about Putin's war and, you know, Putin clearly subjugated, invaded, whatever phrase you want to use.
Yeah.
In he went, this was Ukraine. And you will be aware, and you see it a lot on social media, hang on a second, you know, this is Ukraine. Since when did Ukraine... This was previously described as the most corrupt country in Europe, and now suddenly it's this lovely little vulnerable place that's been invaded by this horrible man in Red Square, and, you know, don't blame Putin, he's just taking what is his. What's your response when you hear that? And you must have heard that probably face-to-face as well as the stuff on social media.
Yeah, I mean, I think not so much with this conflict. I mean, there are two words to describe that viewpoint. It's called Russian propaganda, and essentially, I spent 4 years in Moscow as the bureau chief for the Guardian newspaper there. I was actually kicked out in 2011 because of my reporting, and even you know, more than a decade ago, it was clear there were a group of Russian bloggers paid by the Kremlin who posted stuff, including on your media outlet and all over the place, to try and influence the narrative and the story. And I think what's interesting about Ukraine is that hasn't got much traction. I mean, with a few people on the margins perhaps, but most people see what's happening in Ukraine for what it is, which is a massive, full-scale Russian invasion to destroy the country and to get rid of it.
This has been going on for some time now, of course, and there's been points in this story, I think maybe a few months just before Christmas, I think we were talking to one Ukrainian MP where it looked as if, or it certainly felt for a moment, that there was a corner was being turned here. I sense now that has gone away. Was that corner ever there? Was I imagining that? Or what's the status of where we're at today?
Well, I mean that's a good question. I mean, I think the momentum is with Ukraine, but only just. I mean, bear in mind that the last tumultuous year, which I watched sort of close up, the Ukrainians managed to claw back about half of the territory that Russia had occupied since the full-scale invasion in February. So they had really stunning counteroffensives in Kharkiv and the northeastern Kherson, where I was in November, which they pushed the Russians back. Now we're in a new phase of the war. Vladimir Putin has mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops. It's clear he thinks he can still win. And what we expect in the spring is a big, massive Russian offensive, probably from the east, but possibly from other directions as well. And
what about the West's response to this? You know, we hear stories of tanks and, you know, obviously NATO at arm's bay for obvious reasons. It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because the moment somebody gives a big green light to accelerating this, you know, in a more forthright manner, then all hell potentially breaks loose.
Well, I mean, the thing is, you know, that's Putin's calculation. I mean, he very much expected the West to kind of flake, actually, to not like the invasion of Ukraine, but to not do very much about it. And instead, what we've seen is a huge anti-Kremlin coalition with the UK playing a leading role, with the Biden administration actually getting heavily involved. And this has allowed Kiev to make some gains. But what Putin is reckoning on is a long, grinding war where eventually we will lose interest and he will prevail. So we have to see where we are. But, you know, my sense is this war is not going to be over by the summer, and I think it's not going to finish this year.
What is likely to happen? Because there's also media reports, you know, that Putin's very ill. You know, we've heard apparently he's got everything wrong with him, depending on which report you listen to. He's not in good shape, and once he's gone, then that's when the deck begins to fall. Is that true? Is there a likelihood that this man has only got a certain amount of time left, either politically or literally?
There was a lot of speculation at the beginning of the war that he was ill. I mean, certainly he doesn't look in great shape. If you watch him walking, one of his arms doesn't move. There are rumours, not confirmed, that Putin possibly uses doubles, certainly that a lot of the kind of video footage of him is sort of spliced together, that it's not actually authentic. And what we know from the pandemic is that he's extremely reluctant to meet people face to face. I mean, the defining image of late Putin is him at one end of a very long table and some hapless minister at the other end.
Yes.
But I don't think...
Macron you just referred to.
Well, or Shoigu, the defense minister. But the bottom line is I don't think we can assume that he's going to, croak anytime soon. And even were something to happen to him, it's pretty clear that the system made up of power guys, KGB people, intelligence officers would pick someone quite similar to replace him.
So it would just be replaced, like for like?
I mean, I think there would be a hiatus. I mean, that would certainly be a moment where Ukraine could perhaps consolidate or maybe even sort of push forward. But for now, unfortunately, I don't see a palace coup against Putin. I don't see much changing inside Russia.
So how can this end? Because there is a sense then for many it may have to get worse in terms of casualties, civilian or military casualties, before it gets better. Is that it's a grim, but is that an accurate assessment?
Well, I mean, I think more people are going to die this year, this month. Civilians, of course, but also soldiers on both sides. But Ukraine's got no choice but to keep fighting. I mean, they point out that if they're overrolled, then some of the scenes that I wrote about in my book that we saw in places like Bucha, town north of Kiev, and Mariupol, which was absolutely flattened by the Russians, where many civilians were killed, will be repeated all across the country. So they have to keep going. And Putin as well knows that if he loses this war, probably that's the end of his regime and possibly him personally. So he's escalating in classic style. So we have a grinding conflict ahead of us.
There was a documentary that featured Boris Johnson, which you'll be familiar with. In the last couple of days, we've been learning Boris Johnson said Vladimir Putin threatened him with a missile strike in an extraordinary phone call in the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine. The then Prime Minister told Mr. Putin... said Mr. Putin told him it would only take a minute. The Kremlin today said Boris Johnson is lying. Do you think this happened?
I mean, Ian, it's a kind of un-beauty contest. I mean, basically, the Kremlin lies about everything all the time. So were they to tell the truth, it would be quite hard to recognise that as truth, because so much of what they say is propaganda. And on the other hand, I mean, I don't want to kind of defame our former Prime Minister, but his track record for telling the truth is also not the best, shall we say. So I think something similar may have happened. I mean, it's certainly true that Putin uses KGB tactics, uses threats. Famously, knowing that Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, hated dogs, let the dog into his pet Labrador into their discussions. That it may have been a kind of spooking
That's a pretty mean thing to do, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it's the KGB. I mean, they're more than mean. I mean, they see themselves involved, whether we like it or not, in a kind of endless civilizational struggle with the West. And they still think they're fighting the Cold War, and this time they're going to win. And what they like to do is exploit our weakness and disunity, buy up certain politicians, possibly in this country, certainly elsewhere, and sort of kind of wreck our politics from inside.
In terms of your own reporting, I mean, you've been at the coalface of this, as you say. You know, if it's journalism on the ground, there's nobody, there's no PA that's just going to suddenly feed you, here's a line, follow this, and get a quote from Mr. Smithers over there, which we know can happen in journalism, all too often, sadly. This is work. You've got to do your own homework. You've got to build your own story, your own contacts, etc. That must put you in must have put you in some pretty dangerous situations, particularly with this war in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, actually, funnily enough, the war is horrible and horrendous. But I mean, it's been easier for me to report on for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I've been going to Ukraine since about 2007. When I was in Moscow, I did regular trips there, so I'm familiar with its politics. Also, I speak Russian, so that helps. I mean, Putin claims that he's saving Russian speakers, but he's actually killed thousands of them since the war started. But actually, the worst episode was funnily enough in Moscow when I was working there, and KGB agents, or from the FSB, which is what the KGB is called these days, broke into our apartment, bugged it, I was told by the British Embassy. And so we spent about 4 years, my wife and I and our kids, living under surveillance, where nothing we did was private, where there were all sorts of nasty hints dropped by Kremlin officials that my kids might meet with an accident. Or why did I stay and report in this country?
To deal with that as an ongoing.
Well, I mean, I wrote a book after I got booted out called Mafia State, and that basically encapsulates.
That would do it.
Well, that was after they kicked me out.
Right,
I mean,
okay.
that encapsulates kind of where we are with this regime. I mean, the people at the top are terrifically rich. Putin is probably the richest man in the world. Certainly the people around him are all billionaires, many of them proxies for his personal fortune. So you have the kleptocracy, but also you have this hardline ultranationalism, which just where the elite sees itself at war with us, with London, with the UK, with America, and so on. And it's an incredibly toxic combination in a society which was unfree when I was there, and now I would say is totalitarian.
What's your sense of what the truth is in terms of support for Putin? Because again, that's one of those stories that seems to flip-flop. Once in a while, somebody will come up with a report and say, despite everything, he still has 70% popularity, blah blah blah. What's the truth of that? I know it's a hard question to get to the truth of in itself, but as far as you can ascertain, what is the situation in terms of how Russians view their leader?
It's a really good, interesting question, and I have to sort of admit I haven't been there since 2011 when I was put in a jail cell and thrown out. But based on conversations with Russians I know, some in exile, and now it's pretty clear he enjoys what you might call a majority of support. And that's not because he's a genius, it's because propaganda works. I know over the years, for example, Russians have been told that Ukrainians are subhuman, that they're animals, that they're fascists, that they're Nazis, and this kind of sinks in. So there is a lot of support, and also cleverly, the regime has let the borders open. So people who don't like it have left. I mean, they've left in huge numbers for places like Georgia, for Armenia. Some have come to London or Prague or Riga. And so most of the population is passive. Most of it believes what it sees on television, and most of it, but not all of it, supports Putin.
And I would imagine, if you're sitting there in your apartment just off Moscow High Street and Mori come round doing a poll saying, what do you think of Putin? I would imagine there's probably only one answer you would safely feel comfortable in giving.
Yeah, and we're sort of back. I mean, it's interesting for people who remember the Soviet Union. I would say Russia is now more repressive than the late Soviet Union. I don't know if you remember, Brezhnev and some of those leaders from the early 80s, Andropov. We're now careering back to the 1930s. I mean, there was one story I was reading this morning of some people sitting in a restaurant in provincial Russia who were talking about their opposition to the war, and they were reported by a neighbouring diner, and then they were taken away by the police, and their 9-year-old kid was dragged off God knows where. So we're at that sort of whispering in the kitchen stage already, which is highly reminiscent of the USSR.
Listen, Luke, thank you, sir. Thank you for coming in. Luke's book is called Invasion: Russia's Bloody War and Ukraine's Fight for Survival, and it's out now.